Okay, so today we are learning about the war in the Pacific. So some big differences between the European theater war and the Pacific theater war. One glaring difference was the weather. In the European theater, they had all four seasons, lots of snow, cold winters. But in the Pacific theater, it's tropical. Lots of beaches, lots of heat and humidity, so it was very, very different. The two theaters of war, the two different styles of fighting. Pacific theater was going from island to island to island, so the Navy and Air Force played an important role. And then in Europe, it was a lot of ground assaults and slow progression over time. As you can see in these pictures, these are not pictures you would see in Europe, especially like the palm trees. And then this picture on the top right here, this is the famous picture from Iwo Jima, and this picture is made into a life-size statue for the Marine Memorial in Washington, D.C., right by the Arlington National Cemetery. So they've made a life-size replica of this picture as the Marine Memorial. So here's the map, and you guys did this the other day. With the mapping activity we did Friday and Monday. So Japan started our war with us in Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. We see here this dark red line here outlining the furthest extent of the Japanese Empire during this time period. A lot of historians say World War II kind of started in China. When Japan was attacking China, they were attacking Manchuria and taking over parts of China early in the 1930s. One of the bad areas was Nanjing, where the Japanese people basically raped and murdered nearly the entire city. It was pretty disgusting, the things the Japanese did to the Chinese. They murdered about 20 million people, 20 million Chinese people, as reported. So we talked about the Holocaust yesterday, and that was, sick at a different level. Very similar thing happened in China with what the Japanese people did. So today we'll talk about the Philippines. So that's this area here. This was one of our good allies in the area. We'll talk about the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is down in the south. This is where we stopped the invasion of Australia from happening. Battle of Midway. This was what was called the turning point of the war right here. We'll talk about Iwo Jima. So that's right here on the map. So this was February and March 1945. This was a very decisive battle. We'll talk about the Battle of Okinawa, and this is one of the battles where they decided against invading Japan because it was so deadly, so we'll talk about that. There are lots of other battles you could talk about, like Guadalcanal is a very famous battle. If you find the series HBO miniseries called The Pacific, they have it's a very good documentary about the Pacific Theater of War. It's really, really good. HBO put it together a couple of years ago. So anyway, let's get started. So leadership, different leadership in the Pacific than in the Europe, because they couldn't be two places at once. So General MacArthur, he was the leader of the Pacific Theater. So he was Eisenhower was the leader in Europe. So MacArthur is the same leader position, but in the Pacific. Chester Nimitz, he was the commander of our naval forces in the Pacific. He helped break the Japanese code. So everybody used code talk back then. So that the enemy didn't know what they were saying, and he helped break that code and started that island hopping campaign, where you go island to island, eradicating your enemy. And then George Marshall, he was the organizer, chief of staff, so to speak. They call him the organizer of victory. So he was able to build and supply about 8 million military members, and then oversee the creation of the first atomic bomb that we used. So Japan, why they attacked us first is because of oil. Is one, because we froze their assets in America, and because they thought we were going to get involved anyway, so why not strike first? Japan thought that if they just stall us long enough, we would get tired of the war and negotiate a peace deal, but they were very far mistaken with that. So Japanese aggression, what they took the islands island by island, so it's called island hopping. So we kind of use that same tactic against them. So in early 42, as a response to Pearl Harbor, that's what these pictures are from. These are called the Doolittle raids. Doolittle was he was the leader. He's there pinning a medal to the one of the bombs that we dropped on Tokyo. So they made B-52 bombers, which are huge, heavy bombers. And they made them light enough to take off from an aircraft carrier. And they sailed close enough to Japan to take off, and then they bombed Tokyo. And then the planes landed in China. So the purpose of this was not to deal ending blow to Japan and end the war. It was just to basically show them that, hey, we can attack you just like you attacked us, and kind of an embarrassment to Japan. And basically to show, like, we're not weak. We're going to take you head on, so to speak. Right, so we're going to go into timeline here. So the Philippines, this is December 41. We began the invasion. We had about 80,000 troops there. So as the Japanese invaded the Philippines, MacArthur, he was ordered, hey, get off the island. And he was famously quoted as saying, I'll be back, basically. I forget the exact quote, but basically saying, I'll be back and we'll liberate you. So they get the leadership off, but most of the troops fell victim to the Japanese here, which led to what's called the Bataan Death March, which basically they were transferring them from one prison camp to another, but they were forcing them to walk in the tropical desert with no water, no food, about a 60-mile march. It's estimated over 75,000 United States prisoners of war, or POWs, started the march. And it's estimated between 6,000 and 11,000 died on that march. So common causes of death: beheadings, throat cutting, shootings, bayonets, so being stabbed, rape, disembowelment. Disembowelment's where they would cut your stomach open and pull your insides out. They would just beat the soldier in the head with the butt of his rifle. They would starve them. They would dehydrate them. If you fell during the march, they would kill you. If you tried to help them up, they would kill you if they saw you trying to do it. It was disgusting what the Japanese did here at this Bataan Death March. A lot of the people that died were Filipinos, but they were included in this prisoner of war march. So the next big battle was Coral Sea, and this is a really cool battle because Japan was advancing on Australia, and we knew we could not let them invade Australia. But this battle was almost all by air battle, so planes fighting each other, which showed how important a quality aircraft was and how important a quality pilot was, but also how important the aircraft carriers were in this war. There wasn't really a victor, but Japan did not continue to advance towards Australia, so I guess you could say we won that one. But I bet that was really cool to watch from a distance, right, with all the planes flying around shooting at each other and trying to bomb the aircrafts, or the boats, like this picture on the bottom right. So kind of in that similar southern Pacific area, we get there was the Guadalcanal was just to the east, but we're going to shift focus and go west of Hawaii, called the Battle of Midway. So this beautiful little atoll here, this is Midway Island. That's it. A tiny little island that has an airstrip and a little air base on it. But it was very vital because it was about the midway point in the Pacific Ocean between North America and Asia. So important for refueling. But it's just hard to believe that a major battle was fought here and that this is the turning point of the war when it's a tiny, tiny little island, as you see here. So Japanese soldiers, they were using it as a staging area in June of 42. So remember, they attacked us in January of 41. December of 41. So early into this battle, they were staging it as attacking out different areas. We went on the offensive here. We kind of tricked them here, so to speak, made them think like we weren't there, but then we snuck up on them and destroyed 3 of the Japanese aircraft carriers. So that was the first major defeat of the Japanese Navy. It kind of made them question what was going on. Are they going to win or not win? So this was what we call the turning point of the war. And we started winning battles then, and we started getting closer and closer to Japan after this one. Iwo Jima, this is one of those historic big battles that was just so deadly. So this is February 19th, March 26, 1945. There's Iwo Jima in the bottom left. This famous picture is on that mountain there on that little inlet of or little peninsula on that island, not inlet. So we end up retaking the Philippines, and then we start marching north towards Japan. So Iwo Jima was kind of the next logical island to go at because we could launch airplanes from there and reach Japan. So it's estimated about 20 to 21,000 Japanese were defending the island. They were dug in, they had tunnels, and they were just so difficult to beat. They had the high ground, but roughly 200 survived. So over 20,500 Japanese soldiers died defending Iwo Jima, which wasn't even part of Japan. We lost 6,000 Marines here. This is where this iconic picture that was made into a movie and a book called Flag of Our Fathers. And then this picture also is them on top of that mountain there. And it's them, the Marines, staking claim to the island, saying, hey, we won this battle. So in a lot of these battles, the Japanese did not want to surrender, as we see here, as over 20,000 died. So they would act like they're surrendering a lot of the time and then hold a grenade, and as the Americans got close, they would detonate the grenade and blowing themselves up and hurting Americans. They would just jump off cliffs because they didn't want to surrender, because that Japanese mindset was, don't come home a loser. There were Japanese soldiers still hiding out in these Pacific islands well into the 1900s, and a couple of stories were that they had to find the retired general to go and relieve that soldier of his command, which is just crazy to think about. But, they were very, very loyal to their country. So the next battle is Okinawa. This is when Japan started using kamikaze. So misconception that people have, so the wrong train of thought people have, is that kamikazes were used throughout World War II. Kamikazes were only used when the Japanese was out of good pilots and really good planes. So what they would do is load a plane with bombs, train this young pilot, hey, you're going to fly the plane and into a boat. Well, I don't know how to land. I don't really care if you know how to land, because we don't want you to land. You're a suicide bomber, basically. So what this showed us, though, is that in this battle, 110,000 Japanese died and 7,600 Americans died. So it showed the president. So at this point, this was April to June 45. So this is right when FDR passed away and Truman takes office. So it shows Truman that if we invade Japan, this is what's going to happen. Just the amount of casualties for Japan are just going to be astonishing. So this is where American leadership started to discuss, how do we end this war? Because if we invade Japan, it's going to be super, super deadly and difficult. So how are we going to fix this? Kamikazes, they were used from some data from January 4th to 13th, 1945. They damaged 50 of our boats and sunk 17 of them. Most of them were unsuccessful, but the ones that were successful, dealt a big blow to our Navy. So one cool story is, what did Native Americans do? So Navajo code talkers, Navajo had a specific language that only they knew. The Japanese had never heard this type of language before, so they couldn't decode it. So this is what we used in the Pacific Theater of War, and then again in the Korean Theater of War, to communicate, because the Japanese could not break the code. So this was a very, very vital role in our war effort to defeat the Japanese, because then we could freely communicate with them. The Japanese eventually figured out what was going on, and then they wouldn't kill the Navajo. They would try to capture them. So eventually we had to assign like a buddy basically to the Navajo Indian, and they were told, especially in the Korean War, if they're trying to take the Navajo, you need to kill them. Even if you have to die too, do not let them take the Navajo Indian, because we cannot let them break this code. So that's it for today. Tomorrow we'll talk about what's called the Manhattan Project. So that's the building and the dropping of the atomic bombs, and then two main effects of World War II. All right, have a good day.